And just as we're getting started, I'm going to throw a icebreaker poll into the chat. So you should be able to see that soon. So yeah, go ahead and vote on that and let us know. So the icebreaker question is, have you ever tried to convince a climate denier before? And we'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments if you were successful, how'd it go, all of that stuff. So we're going to wait another 2 minutes, and at 10 past, we're going to get started. But yeah, welcome everyone. Great to see you all here. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Youth.ify Climate Communications Workshop. We are so excited to have you here, and we have a super great session in store for you. So just to kind of go over some ground rules, the first part of the workshop is going to be a panel discussion with all of our speakers. And so for that part of the workshop, we ask that you keep your cameras and microphones off so that everyone can see and hear our speakers clearly. And then after that, we're going to be going into a Q&A and then into the activation or action portion of the workshop, where you can keep your cameras and mics unmuted just to kind of talk and get to know other participants. So Leela, if you could give me the next slide. So introducing our speakers, we have Sigfred, Ancheta, Laura Johnson, Sameera, Polavarapu, and Isha Sangani. And next slide, please. And they're all going to talk about themselves a little bit more once we actually get started. So just to kind of introduce Youth.ify a little bit, we really came from the idea that youth need to be empowered and not just inspired. So Youth.ify is a global platform and network of youth activists from around the world, designed for connection, collaboration, and support. Next slide, please. And if you want to get involved with us in other ways, you can join our community, attend an event, or apply for a position on our team. And we'll be, sharing a little bit more about this at the end of the workshop. But feel free to, reach out to us via email or in the chat if you have any questions about any of that. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dylan, who's going to be our moderator for the rest of this workshop, to lead the panel discussion and Q&A. So thanks everyone again so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. We're really glad to have you all here. And I guess the best way to start is if the speakers could introduce yourselves. I don't know who wants to go first on that one.
I can go first.
Oh, okay.
Oh, go ahead, Isha.
All right,
go
thank
first.
you. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Isha. It's great to be here. Thank you to Apurva and Youth.ify for having me. I am a member of Earth Echo International's Youth Leadership Council. I also am the co-founder and executive director of Earth Strategy, which is an organization that aims to boost connectivity in the youth climate movement and especially help youth engage in policy advocacy. And I also am a college student. And my passions include pushing for important climate legislation and marine science as well.
Hello, everyone. Good day. Good morning here from the Philippines. I'm Sigfred, 21 years old. I'm currently a graduate student taking my MSc in microbiology. And in terms of climate advocacy, I'm a trained climate reality leader, trained last July 2020, and currently works as the Youth Cluster Coordinator for the Climate Reality Project Philippines. My advocacy includes climate education, climate literacy, youth participation in climate policy, and also the NDC process here in the Philippines. Nice to meet you all.
I can go next. My name is Laura Johnson. My pronouns are they, she. Once again, thank you, Apurva and Youth.ify so much for this little workshop. I'm very excited to be here. I am 23 years old. I currently live in Long Beach, California. Prior to the pandemic, I was working as a marine science educator here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. And I'm not doing anything like that right now because the pandemic kind of collapsed all of that. But some of my other experiences include working as a canvasser for Greenpeace. I was the youth programs manager at the nonprofit The Big Blue and You, which is a nonprofit that Apurva actually also works with. And I'm also a climate reality leadership leader, and I was also a student delegate for the first class of See Youth Rise Up. So I consider myself a former youth, still activist, because at 23, I feel like I've aged out of a lot of the youth, more youth-based stuff, but I love talking to the Gen Zers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sameera Polavarapu. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much to Apurva and Youth.ify for having me. I host a podcast called Environmentalist, and it's all about how we can change the way that we learn about and advocate for the environment. My background is working with companies, brands, businesses on climate communications and how we really get out the message about climate change in a way that's accessible to a broader audience. In the past, I've worked with the World Wildlife Fund, writing a lot of their emails and copywriting and projects like Netflix's Our Planet, and then also with brands that are trying to develop a sustainability strategy. So thanks again for having me, and I'm excited to get started.
Okay. So clearly you guys all have a lot of experience in climate communications and just in the environmental field. And so one of the first questions from Annabelle was, how can people get involved in climate communications, and how did you guys kind of get your start? And like Laura, if you want to take that one first, maybe.
Yeah, so there are so many different ways to get involved in climate communications. Personally, I grew up loving the environment. I grew up loving animals and watching Steve Irwin on Animal Planet. And if you look hard enough, you can very easily find these little pockets of people who are participating in the things that you might be interested in participating. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go into public speaking or public or podcast hosting or writing or journalism. You can go into so many other different areas, arts and music and poetry. I think redefining what it means to communicate climate change is really important, because we can talk about it in our daily lives. We can talk about it at our day jobs. It doesn't have to be this very secular kind of thing. And getting involved with kind of educating others about our planet, I think along with Keith, going through something like the climate reality training program and similar programs to that are really, really valuable if you can find it.
Yeah, I think going off of what Laura said, I definitely grew up also really passionate about the environment. And I think the environmental movement has changed a lot since I was growing up. And it was the kind of thing where if you were doing something for the environment, it was very much its own thing. It wasn't something that could intersect with a lot of other things in your life. It was, oh, like your family is researching solar panels. That's the biggest thing in the world. Whereas, a lot of things are becoming normalized. A lot of ways of getting involved are becoming normalized. But beyond that, it's what Laura said. It's about finding those intersections in other industries. And I think for me, climate communications really started to take on a new meaning when I started finding those intersections in my own life and the ways in which I wanted the environmental movement to intersect with my interests. And I'd say that's why I continue to work in the space today, rather than it just being this kind of personality. I feel like I'm really motivated to encourage other people to bring it out of themselves in whichever part of their own personality it fits in.
I can add to what Laura and Sameera said. In my case, I'm a teacher by training. I took education as my undergraduate degree, so it's imperative that I'm a communicator already, especially so that my specialization is on biological sciences. But what really got me into climate communication, into talking about the climate more, is when I attended the climate reality leadership course training last year. Because one thing that we need to do when we try to communicate the climate is also to learn something about the climate in order for us to communicate it correctly. Then also, I think it's imperative for all climate advocates to be climate communicators, because just by simply talking to your friends, your family about the climate, it's already communicating. You're already reaching out to people and talk about the climate crisis and spreading the word about this reality.
So everybody kind of covered a lot of different ways that we can communicate with people. And so one of the questions is, how do we educate people and communicate in a way that inspires them to take action rather than just being discouraging about all the environmental issues that might be out there?
I can start this off. I think I've been really inspired by the frameworks of solutions that exist and the potential for change that's really out there. You know, you look at different projects and research projects that have come to light, like things like Project Drawdown, if you've ever heard of that, United Nations goals, even just setting those goals and understanding that there's something to work towards. I think it's definitely a point of hope and showing people solutions that we can work towards. And
Adding to that, I always use the framework of Al Gore's presentation whenever I communicate the climate crisis. The must we change, can we change, and will we change format of presentations, because I think that format is very effective in communicating the climate crisis, because it doesn't only present the problem, it doesn't only present the reality of the crisis, it also presents the solutions that we have at hand, the things that we can do, and it's not too much alarmist. It's hopeful, and I think it's one way of empowering and inspiring people to act if they know that there are solutions at hand and they can do something.
And I know, Isha, you also do Earth strategy. So kind of how do you use that as a way to educate and inspire people and kind of help guide them towards that path of taking action?
Yeah, I think just the biggest thing is like when you're going up against such a kind of daunting issue like climate change, it's really important to celebrate the small wins and to focus on like getting those smaller but also more concrete victories. And especially in the policy space, I feel like that's much more doable. This week, you know, Washington State, which is where I'm from Seattle. We just had like a whole lobbying event for environmental policy, and it was actually very empowering because, you know, I spend a lot of my time talking about climate change. I spend a lot of my time, you know, wondering about when this issue is going to get resolved and thinking about it and thinking about the environment and all these things. But to just kind of be able to see where your efforts are focused and ultimately where a lot of the product of your hard work will come to fruition, like that is just very, very inspiring. And I think it, like seeing those results, seeing those legislative results really gives me the fuel that I need to continue to be an advocate. So.
Yeah, those were some really good responses. And so another question we've had is, there's also a lot of pushback and a lot of challenges that you might have to overcome as a climate communicator. And what are some ways that you overcome them or deal with those challenges?
I think one of the biggest challenges is just finding the right words at the right time. The words that you use really matter. And especially with something as delicate as the climate movement, there's an opportunity for misinformation at every single turn. It's very dense with information, scientific information, but then also people's emotions are involved and anxieties are involved, and managing all of walking a tightrope. And I think that it's just important to be cognizant of the words that you're choosing and the way that you're framing the problem so that it's encouraging people and uplifting people. And we feel more like we're in it together than a doomsday mentality. So I'd say that's a challenge and a great one to overcome at that.
Yeah, I can definitely add to what Sameera said. Your words are extremely important, and kind of something that I think we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes is really being precise about your language and really trying to, I know there is so much misinformation within climate science to begin with, and making sure, even if whatever, you know, statistic that you're using to argue with somebody, you want to make sure that information is accurate. You, even if it like proves your point, you don't want to give this person a false piece of information. And you know, part of that struggle is you know, knowing in yourself, in your heart, that you know enough about this subject to even argue with it in the first place with somebody else. And it's difficult, and knowing when to keep going and knowing when to kind of pick your battles is also very important as well, because not everybody can win every conversation.
Yeah, and I think going off of that, both of you guys kind of mentioned misinformation. And so one of a question that I have is, where do you guys get your information? How do you know that the information that you have is credible and that you can trust it when you are sharing that with other people, especially for those of you that like run podcasts or like Isha with Earth Strategy, where you're kind of helping to mentor others?
I can actually speak to this one. And I can talk less from my experience with Earth Strategy, and I think more from my experience with Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard, which is a student organization. And it's, you know, when we're trying to convince the leadership of an institution to change their minds, like you have to have so many facts up your sleeve and just be very, very well informed. So I think a lot of that is like one big tip I have is the closer you can get to the primary source of some information, the better. So like, especially if you're talking about science, for example, instead of, you know, going to some article from a like kind of fringe news website that talks about a specific scientific report or like some kind of finding, you want to go to the report itself. So like a good example of that would be the IPCC report that came out in 2018 that sent off alarm bells. And you know, while it is important to look at sources that are kind of like making this information more digestible, it's also very valuable and arguably better to go to the UN report itself and actually read what it says and make sure that your information is correct. So I think just going straight to the source is the most important advice I would give.
I think going off of that, the general rules of, you know, looking at making sure that it's a .org site, a .gov site, things like that kind of help prove more credibility in general. Some sources I really love, I think Columbia Earth Institute does a really great job with their research, and finding your tried and trusted sources for looking at research is really important, because I think it also gives you an opportunity to reach out directly to the authors, the researchers. And something I've found in this community is that people talk to you about the things that they're working on and working towards. It can feel intimidating to just reach out to a random person on the internet, but they're so much more accessible than you think. And there's nothing like hearing it from someone who's gone through the trials of their own research. I think another thing that I find really important is to look at things like sample size and the way that studies are framed, because you can find results on lots of different things, but you have to look at the context within which they're being painted, and whether that's something that like resonates with what you're looking for, and whether that means anything towards the messaging you're trying to communicate to.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of piggyback off of that, another really great resource, excuse me, is Google Scholar. That's a really good place to access a lot of scientific articles. But going off of what Sameera said, kind of re-examining your own critical thinking skills is really important. Getting, like Isha said, also as close to the primary source as possible, and kind of, you know, going back to like 7th grade science class when you were first learning what the scientific method is, you kind of look at the big picture, you see if it seems fishy. You kind of have to examine confirmation bias in there as well, and just really make sure you're constantly re-examining your own self, so you make sure that you are not spreading misinformation through your research, and that you're not only looking at, you know, kind of one-sided things. And that's like something to say right now. There is a lot of you know, contention with, you know, being in an echo chamber right now. And it's, you want to keep those outside ideas fresh, but you also want to make sure it's all accurate. I'm kind of just rambling now. So Keith, you have anything to say?
Yes. I can add to that maybe one thing, because I'm also a researcher by profession and currently taking my MSc. One thing that I always do is to check multiple sources and verify the facts. For example, in the Climate Reality Project, we are already given our slideshows, preset slideshows, and it's just up to us to tailor fit that to our presentations. What I do is when something is not familiar to me, I try to look at the sources and also check for other sources as well. We have the IPCC here in the Philippines. We have our National Panel of Technical Experts. We have other non-government organizations and CSOs producing facts. We also have independent research institutions, academic institutions doing those things. But we need to make sure, just like what others said, that these things are peer-reviewed, these things are verifiable, and it's not something fishy.
Yeah, and I think you guys talked a lot about definitely like educating yourself and having all the information, but it is really hard to like know everything. And so have you ever come across a time where someone maybe asked you something or brought up their own information and you actually didn't have a statistic or information to support what you were saying, or you kind of drew a blank, and kind of how did you deal with that and kind of continue and keep your credibility in that situation?
So I want to jump right in and answer this, because when you are being trained to work as an educator at the aquarium, there are hundreds of different species that you have to teach people about. And you might not come from a specific marine science background if you end up in one of these communications positions. So something that they teach you how to do is say, okay, let's say like a little kid comes up to you, what's that fish? Okay, I don't know, but let's look at it. What does the shape of its fin look like to you? Does it look like it swims fast, or does it look like it swims slowly? If it swims fast, what kind of food do you think it eats? If it swims slow, what kind of food do you think it eats? So you can kind of get people to start asking questions about something without like having a specific answer for them in the first place.
I also think the greatest thing that you could do for somebody is not misinform them, as I've kind of started to talk about. I think that if you don't know something, there really is no harm in, no, you act, not no harm. You absolutely should not pretend to know what you're talking about, because I mean, like I said, it's such a complicated movement. It's very much also, the facts are still developing in some areas, they're changing. You have to stay up to date with the news. So the chances of you getting caught in a situation where you don't know something, I think has probably happened to almost anyone. So it's important to just be humble in that moment and accept that you don't know what you don't know, and maybe offer to help them find the right.
Yeah, and then oh, go ahead.
Can I
Keith.
add?
Yeah.
Can I add something? Okay. So for the past months, I've been doing webinars, and whenever someone asks me a question and I don't have the specific answer or any background about that, what I do is I tell them to leave their contact. I'll get right to them. This is also what we practiced when I was still teaching. When we ever we do not know something, we tell them that, okay, I'm not familiar with that concept, but I will try to learn more about that, then I could pass to you the information or try to teach you about that later.
Yeah, I think that's a really good response. And so just to kind of segue into a different topic, but a lot of people are wondering, I think this is more directed at Sameera and Keith, but what are some ways that you can, how do you build a podcast and kind of advice for people looking to start their own, and challenges that you kind of faced and that you wish you had more information on when you started?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that building the podcast really came from having a clear idea for what one I wanted to talk about. I think that when you're building out a podcast, the most important thing to do is really scope out your narrative and understand the story you're trying to tell. Um, Look around and see what else is out there. Why is your voice different? And really own your niche. And once you've done that and you have that story, I would say start developing some episodes and see how they fit together. Like really build out the first 2, 3, 4, so you understand kind of how that flow is going to look like. And once I kind of had that narrative down and I was like, oh, this is my show, this is my concept, I went ahead. I use a hosting platform called Anchor. I have a microphone and that's literally it. I record on GarageBand. It's a super simple thing. I edit it myself. I wouldn't say super simple, but I mean, it's not something that takes an expert to do by any means. And I think the most important thing is putting yourself out there, reaching out to people who have interesting stories to tell that fit your narrative. And a lot of the work is just in the planning and in the preparation and the organization. And that's what's ultimately going to make your podcast successful.
To add to what Sameera said, I think she covered almost all of it. But just to add, I think if you want to start a podcast, think if the podcast format or platform is really the best way that you can communicate the climate crisis, based on your expertise or based on what you want to communicate. Because um, podcasts are more audio, um, and catering to audio learners. And if your topics or if the things that you want to communicate would work more on webcasts or webinar formats, then think again. But if you really want to start a podcast, you really need to do research. You really need to do practice, editing, searching for platforms and other things. Because we actually had a webinar or podcast workshop just days ago, and this one veteran podcaster told us about the things you need to do during pre-production, production, post-production, the things you need to do beforehand, the research part. And it's not very complicated, but it still needs a lot of work, just like other formats. So if you really want to do it, then you need to prepare and love what you're doing.
I think that was all a lot of really great advice for other people. I guess we are starting the action-based workshop part of the session soon. So I guess one final question that I had was the best advice for youth getting involved in kind of that transition from youth to adult activists. And I know that Laura kind of touched on this earlier, but kind of what are some differences that you guys have noticed from when you guys were like high school or younger as activists and kind of involved in this field, and then kind of growing up and getting older to college and past that? And what are some of the differences that you noticed and biggest lessons that you've learned?
I would say, just based on my personal experience, I think right now most people who are currently in like their peak youth activist space find that people in positions of power tend to listen to you specifically because you are younger. I know that based on personal experience. I know that based on my friends' experience. And I think as you get older, you kind of don't have that to hang on anymore. And you kind of have to figure out how to get those people to continue to listen to you and communicate effectively. You kind of have to adapt in that way. But then I also think there are things like going through school and going through high school and college and then graduating and then being out in the workforce is very, very different from being a student and being an activist, because you have so many more things that you have to worry about now being an adult. And sometimes it's really, really difficult to balance those two parts of your life. And there are some things that you will eventually have to, reckon with in terms of like reducing your personal carbon footprint. Sometimes you just can't afford to do that as you're getting older. And sometimes it's, you don't have like your parents to lean on necessarily, or you don't have like the same different communities that you used to be able to lean on as you get older. So I think just being adaptable as a person is really important to hold on to as you get older.
To me, I see it as a really big transition into your own individuality in some ways. Really understanding what the years of youth activism has taught you about what you're most passionate about, and letting that guide you forward, and letting that be the anchor for what you want to continue with. Because, like Laura said, as life does get busier, life really becomes about prioritization in some ways. And within the climate movement, there are so many different angles, there's so many different issues. And to think that you're going to be fighting for every single one, not by any means, but it becomes increasingly more difficult. And your power might be better suited to focus on something that you know you truly, truly know inside and out and can communicate to the best of your ability on one hand, and two, really holds a special place in your heart.
Isha or Keith, did you guys have any last things to add on that?
Yeah, I can speak from the perspective of, I guess, somebody who has kind of like is going through this transition currently. The biggest piece of advice I would have is just like, really try to prioritize and like figure out
Isha, I think you might be cutting out a little bit. If turning off your camera helps with that, I don't know. Isha, is there a chance that you can repeat what you just said one more time? Because I think you cut out, so a lot of people missed it.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, prioritizing is very important. So just figuring out what is most important, and like figuring out, really pinpointing what ways that you think are most effective of advocacy. That's like just a good practice in general, but especially if you're short on time, you're kind of forced to do that. So
Just to add to what all of them said, I think when you're going to transition from activism or youth advocacy to adult activism, you need to remember what you are fighting for. Because whether you're an adult activist or a youth activist, you are still fighting for one thing: climate justice and making the world a better place. It's just so that when you become an adult, you will have a more specific role in the solutions part. For example, if you're a teacher by profession, if you're a researcher by profession, if you're a business person, then remember that to integrate what you have been fighting during your youth activism years to what you are doing now. So that's the message that I can give to it.
And then we're going to transition into the action-based part of our workshop. Yeah, so we wanted to give you guys a skill that you guys can also take away from this workshop. So that skill is kind of how to have a conversation with a climate denier. And just keep in mind, like, this is a skill that it's not just for environmentalism. You can also bring the skill to other parts of your life, just like talking to people who disagree with you on certain issues. And so these are some tips from our speakers that might help you with that.
Okay, so the first one is prepare yourself. Of course, you cannot go into a battle without your arms, without your guns, without any preparation whatsoever. So you need to do your research. You need to read about the climate crisis, the current issues, the current science about that, in order for you to have actually sound arguments whenever you communicate to someone, especially to those hardcore conspiracy theorists or those who are engaged in disinformation campaigns. But of course, always remember to be grounded on facts and have facts around you. Also, what you can do is to practice to your friends and family. I have been doing that with my friends. I try to practice my presentations with them, make sure that everything is clear, because if you're going to present something that's ambiguous or something that isn't clear, I think that would do more harm than good. And lastly is to be ready, because climate denial roots from many different things, and the climate deniers is a very tricky realm to enter. And climate deniers are of different spectrums. Some of them have, or the denial is rooted on anxiety. Some of them, or some of the denial is rooted on disinformation campaigns or just the backgrounds that they have. So be ready and make sure to have the skills and the background that you have.
So number 2 is build trust and rapport. It's really important to form a connection with people and kind of meet them where they are, because oftentimes when we're talking about the climate movement, activists in general have gotten the bad reputation, the stereotype of course, preaching to people or making others feel like maybe they're not informed. So using a combination of storytelling, personal experiences, science, adjusting to people's personalities, and really understanding what types of communication are going to work best with an individual versus just spitting out facts or just trying to get across the message as quickly as possible, as passionately as possible, checking your tone, your delivery, everything like that will really ensure that you're creating that trust to open up and have a conversation in the first place.
Okay, so we lost Isha, and I'm going to take over this slide. Asking people questions to kind of figure out where their beliefs come from. Why don't they believe in climate change? Like he said, I wrote it down. It was such a good quote. Climate denial is a spectrum. You don't necessarily know if, just by looking at the person, if they specifically deny climate change or they deny science altogether. So you kind of have to, building off of what Sameera just said, learn about them, build that rapport, trust them, and get to the point where you can start to dig a little bit deeper. Like I mentioned earlier, trying to get them to question what they haven't previously considered, adjust your own approach accordingly. Kind of taking a look at what they have already said in that conversation and see if you can pick up on any hints that might lead you to believe, oh, well, this person might just be confused about why seasons change, and they don't understand that when it's cold in the winter, that doesn't necessarily mean climate change isn't happening. So you can kind of pick up on these little hints throughout your conversation by digging with these kinds of questions. Next slide. And then addressing their concern. The other side of answering questions and asking questions is listening to their side of their story, try to talk in their language and ask about what is important to them, and try to connect to them on a personal level. Because if you can get them to think about, oh, well, they might have a little niece or a nephew or a little young cousin or somebody in their neighborhood who's really young, like 10 years old or less. You can ask them about that and say, what is their life going to look like 50, 80 years down the road, potentially? And see if you can make it a little bit more relevant to their personal life story, because that will open them up to being a little bit more malleable, I guess is the word, when it comes to accepting that climate change is a thing. And then this last little point here, focusing on food, water, and energy. Talking a lot about different topics can get really broad, really fast, really confusing. So personally, when I am discussing with a climate denier, focusing on food, water, and energy is a really good way to do that. Thinking about how many people we have on this planet. There are so many of us, but we don't necessarily have the right amount of food, the right amount of water, and the right amount of energy in certain places to be able to sustainably hold as many people as we're going to have on this planet, 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So, well, okay, maybe you don't believe in climate change, but does this particular area of the world have enough water? No? Cool. That's something that we can still talk about. And see if you can direct the conversation away from kind of more heated topics than that, we'll say. Next slide. And then, of course, supporting them on their journey. There is always going to be the chance that you are very good at communicating climate change. I hope after this workshop that you all leave here feeling like you'd be able to potentially help change somebody's mind, and be prepared in the event that they do change their mind for them to be really, really, really scared. Because I think we all know here on this Zoom call that climate change is really, really scary, and it's a very overwhelming issue. And, you know, if you're going to be the person to try to get them to do something about this issue, you also have to then be the person who they can go to when they feel scared about this issue. So acting as a support structure if they do begin to change their ideas, and show them a way forward by explaining the solutions. I think something to keep in the back of your head is focus 80% on solutions and 20% on the problem, because that moving forward is a lot more sustainable than the other way around.
It's a great tip. So it's a known fact that 73% of Americans actually do believe in climate change, but 42% of them don't think that it's going to affect them in their lifetimes. So this is just one example of how you need to frame the problem and consider the root of climate denial, or the ambiguity that comes with climate denial coming on a spectrum. So keep an open mind and tone, use tools and aids, visuals, graphics, etc., and use those facts from well-written tweets or articles, journals, and just have a sincere conversation in good faith.